What is it that makes a tune like John Williams' Harry Potter theme so fantastic? What is it that makes it so catchy that it instantly gets stuck in your head, so potent that you can hear it over and over again without growing tired of it, and so emotionally deep that it seems to have the spiritual undercurrent of the entire Harry Potter series imbued into that small combination of pitch frequencies? Many people think that tunesmithing is often the most elusive aspect of music composition, either a gift you have or you don't, and not something that can be taught, but rather we must simply wait for the muse to strike, and if we're lucky, we may get something. Actually, almost all of the most beloved and famous tunes follow very similar principles of structure and technique, which we are going to examine throughout the course of this video. The art of writing a great tune is sorely missed and underappreciated in today's day and age, whether in the concert hall or the movie theater. Additionally, while there are countless compendiums in the topics of harmony, orchestration, and counterpoint, melody writing, which is arguably the most important and fundamental aspect of music composition, suffers very little literary treatment from the great master composer writers. As Mozart once said, melody is the essence of music. Although there are many famous and utterly moving pieces of music without extroverted melody, catchy tunes were certainly a core aspect of Mozart's style, and even if you aren't particularly interested in writing the next big tune that everyone is whistling, the ability to pull out a well-crafted, emotionally impactful, memorable melody every once in a while is an invaluable skill, especially for the media composer. While some of the greatest pieces of music ever written don't necessarily contain the best tunes, it is nevertheless an incredibly important skill for the composer to possess when he needs it. And that applies doubly for the film and game composer, where effective tunes can not only help to move the story forward leitmotivically, but also, from a branding perspective, help to set the game or film apart from others and make it recognizable. Think only of the Mario theme or Star Wars. After studying many great melodies from the master tunesmiths like Tchaikovsky, Mozart, George Gershwin, John Williams, and Koji Kondo, I found some principles that seem to be very common amongst the most memorable ones, the distillation of which helped myself as a guideline when composing melodies. These are merely things to ponder, not rules by any stretch of the imagination. Many an excellent tune violates any number of these principles. To further emphasize this point, I'll quote Aaron Copland. Why a good melody should have the power to move us has thus far defied all analysis. We cannot even say with any degree of surety what constitutes a good melody. Still, most people think they know a beautiful melody when they hear one. Therefore, they must be applying certain criteria, even though unconscious ones. Though we may not be able to define what a good melody is in advance, we certainly can make some generalizations about melodies that we already know to be good, and that may help to make clear characteristics of good melodic writing. Most non-musicians tend to refer to a theme, melody, and tune as all being synonymous, but technically speaking, they aren't. So before we begin, let us define a tune. Firstly, what isn't a tune? A melody is any type of linear musical line, which means that a tune is a melody, but not all melodies are tunes. A tune is not a theme, which is a small motive designed to be open-ended and incomplete for the purpose of development. A tune is not an ostinato, which is designed as a repetitive figure to support other musical material and provide a rhythmic and/or harmonic backbone for it. And finally, a tune isn't a bass line or inner line whose purpose is to serve other material, not stand on its own as an independent entity. A tune is your primary material. It's the hook, the thing that gets stuck in your head. There are plenty of incredible pieces of music without incredible tunes in them, but that's not the type of music we're focusing on today. We're talking about a great melody that is simple enough to be remembered after hearing it only once and whistled by the layman, that is catchy enough to be contagiously passed from one whistler to another, and that is emotionally powerful enough to achieve a visceral response in the soul, even when played unaccompanied as a single line. And when it ends, it feels completed and satisfied, like it contained an entire way of looking at the world within it, and nothing needs to be said more about it to reveal more of its character. It is all-inclusive, in and of itself. Here are just a few examples of some great tunes. I'm sure you've heard most of them, but if you haven't, be sure to check them out. Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Ode to Joy, which is the common name for the famous tune from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the fourth movement, Mozart's G minor Symphony, first movement, My Favorite Things, from The Sound of Music, Shostakovich's Waltz, number 2, Amazing Grace, God Bless America, pretty much any Christmas carol ever, Silent Night, Joy to the World, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, etc., Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, Movement 2, the Indiana Jones theme, and the Mario theme. I always like to split melody writing into 3 categories. These are check boxes, so to speak, and I like to use them as a guideline when I write my own melody. I think all of the greatest melodies ever written follow and satisfy these 3 requirements. The first is emotional impact. That is, the melody moves you. It causes you to feel something deep inside. It doesn't just seem shallow, but it causes you to come in touch with some emotion. And I think some of the deepest melodies cause you to feel an emotion that either you haven't felt in such a long time that you forgot it existed, or a new emotion that you can't put words in. Some of the greatest music does this. The second criteria is catchiness. Obviously, the tune has to be catchy, and a lot of this has to do with simplicity, rhythmic cells. We'll talk about this in detail down the road, but definitely catchiness. And with popular music and film music, this is usually the primary thing that people tend to focus on. They try to make their melody very catchy, usually by implementing a lot of repetition or making it as simple as possible. But we'll talk about how you can go about making your melody catchy without necessarily dumbing it down or making it overly simplistic. And the final criteria, of course, is originality. You want your theme to sound like your own. If you are a composer of music, I'm sure you've presented your piece of music to someone else and someone has said, oh, that sounds like John Williams, or oh, that sounds like Mozart, or, it's just a sinking feeling when you write something and the first thing it does is remind your listener of someone else. Now, obviously, you can't always avoid this sort of comparison. I think especially non-musicians tend to be obsessed with figuring out exactly what this piece of music sounds like and categorizing it in their head. But you don't want your melody to sound like another melody. Now, when you get all three of these criteria together, that's when you get a great melody. I'll give you one example, the first in the list, which is Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Now, think about it. It's original. Da-dee-da-da-da-da-dee-da-da. Everything about the rhythm, the combination of notes, the octave leap, it's just a very unique melody. You can't recall any other tune that it reminds you of. It's a very unique melody. It's very original. Additionally, it's very emotionally impactful. It's soaring. Every aspect of his contour, the way that it falls and goes up high, and then sort of, the way that Dorothy is thinking about what life would be like over the rainbow, and then it sort of gradually comes back down into Kansas. Of course, that's a very romantic interpretation. But, the melody has a very deep emotional impact. And finally, it's very catchy. It's an effortless tune to remember, and even now, years and decades after that movie came out, people still remember the tune. People still hum it all the time. I've heard people hum that tune, and people are still doing covers of it. There's something catchy about it, something that makes it get stuck in your head. That is an example of a great melody. So first, let's talk about originality. Don't just use your ear, experiment. A good friend of mine once said about Williams tunes, "It's like I knew what he was going to say, but if he hadn't have said it, I never could have." This is the kind of thing you're striving for. A lot of people think that originality means weird or out there or strange, but that's not necessarily true. You can make a catchy tune that's inevitable, but it's also original. I think the biggest thing that's helped me personally is to be very experimentational and don't just start with the blank page in your ear. If you go and sit down at the piano, or if you go to your blank sheet music or your, scoring notation software, your ear is immediately going to think of things similar to the melodies that you've heard before. You're just going to rewrite, other tunes or cliches, and it's going to be very difficult to be original. I found that, unless you have something that sort of pops into your head, and you write it down like Beethoven did, which does happen from time to time, but that can't be relied upon, especially if you have a deadline. So I think the best thing for me personally, is to try and figure out what you're trying to express first off. If there's a particular character that you're trying to express, if there's a particular emotion, if you're writing for a film, if there's a particular area and a certain, aesthetic that you're trying to, let's say if you're writing, medieval music or Egyptian music or a love theme, you can start with some general ideas and your knowledge about music to sort of get you along that way. So, and then usually what you do is you take those quote unquote cliches. So for example, let's say like, A major and then D minor 6. That's a very, very common chord progression for love themes. Williams uses it all the time. One example is the Princess Leia theme. Da 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 la dum ba da dum. And it's basically just major 1, minor 4. So you could start out with something like that, but then what you want to try to do is you want to try to make the other aspect of the melody as original as possible. In other words, whatever is cliche, make the other aspect not cliche. You don't want everything to be original, because then no one's going to, it's not going to latch on, people aren't going to latch onto it, and you don't want it all to be cliche because then it'll just be boring and cliche. So if the rhythm is very simple and cliche, the contour has to be very original. And if the contour is very cliche or very dull, then the rhythm needs to be very interesting. One example, tune that I wrote a while back for a little YouTube anime series goes like this: bum ba dum bum ba dum ba da dum bum 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 ba dum da da dum bum 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 bum, and it's just basically just an E minor chord, la da 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 da, and there's nothing really interesting about an E minor chord. So when I had that, I said, well, let me try to make it interesting with rhythmic syncopation. Lum ba dum bum ba dum da da dum bum 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 bum. You always want to examine the material that you have when you're working with it and try to make half of its aspects original, and the other half of its aspects cliche, for lack of a better word. And I think that sort of balance is what you want to do. You want it to feel familiar and new at the same time. That's sort of what you're going for. Okay. Also, an original cell breeds an original melody. And this, I cannot stress how important it is to have a good cell, because when I say cell, I mean like a rhythmic theme, a small collection of notes. And this is one thing that John Williams is very good at. You know, all of his melodies, the entire melody is woven out of a single cell. You know, like the Indiana Jones theme, bum ba dum bum. That was terrible intonation, sorry. But the entire theme is based on that da 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 da. You know, with it's that ascending motive with ascending, stepwise motive with the dotted rhythm. That little tiny 1, 2, 3, 4, that little cell makes the whole melody. Listen to it. Bum ba bum bum, bum ba bum, bum ba bum bum, bum ba bum bum bum, bum ba bum bum. Bum, ba, bum. The whole melody comes from that cell. That's what keeps it unified and catchy, and that's also what makes it original, is because of the fact that he came up with an original cell that doesn't sound like something else. Then it by extension, makes the entire melody original. Another thing that you can do to help boost the originality is try out the harmonic relativity. I don't know if you've seen my video series on that, but oftentimes if you start out with a very unique chord progression and you try to come up with a catchy melody, because of the fact that you're not doing things that most composers have tried and true over and over again, hundreds and hundreds of times, typical chord progressions, because you're trying something new, you just might come up with something that is very unique and very original. So that's something that sometimes I'll do if I'm ever in a rut and I just have writer's block. I'll start with a weird chord progression and see if that leads me to some new melodic content, just following the chord progression as a guideline. Another little tip is an unoriginal or cliche few notes can be excused and or justified if led up molecularly by the previous phrase, because your listeners will hear it in a different light and context. Now, what I mean by that is that sometimes you'll hear a little bit of notes and it sounds cliche, but if it relates itself molecularly, if it's related rhythmically or contour-wise to the previous notes that came before it, it can be justified because your brain doesn't compare it to other melodies and say, oh, that's cliche. Your brain compares it to what came before it, and it's justified as being a part of that melody. I'll give you an example from Jurassic Park. Da-dum, bum, 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 bum. That type of descending scale-wise, dun-dun-dum, bum-bum, bum-bum, is a little cliche, right? It's very similar to, like, Back to the Future, dun-dun-dum, ba-da-dum, bum-bum-bum. You know what I mean? A lot of people tend to use that sort of, sol, fa, mi, re. But in the context of the melody, it comes as a response of the previous notes, and that's what, makes it not seem cliche. You sing the whole melody, da-da-da, do-do-do, ba-da-da-da-da-dee-dee, da-da-da-da-da, dee-dee-dee, la-da-da-da-da-da-da. You suddenly know how it relates to the previous material, and it's commenting on the previous material, so it doesn't seem cliche. So that's a little thing to be aware of, is that don't ever take little bits of notes in a vacuum, but always take the melody as a whole and figure out how each phrase and cell relates to the one that comes after it and relates to the one that comes before it. Another thing, don't always find the most obvious solution or the smoothest solution. Find the best solution. A lot of times, I'm very guilty of this. I've written so much music I'm very young, but I've written a lot of music, and so my brain always finishes melodies with the same type of, finish, and Mozart is guilty of this too. You write a melody that's nice and original, but then you use that same cadence that you always use. For me, it's always a suspension on the dominant chord, dum, ba ba bum. I always tend to end my melodies like that. So just because it sounds right because your brain is so used to hearing it, don't go with that. Try and find a better solution, something that's original and is satisfying, but also, very unique. One example I can think of is the Jane Eyre theme, which goes like this. So that last little bit, da 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 da, da da, the da da da, almost seems unrelated to what came before it motivically. It's not what you expect it to do, but it feels right, and once you hear it that way, you can't hear it any other way. Also, sometimes you can take another melody and change the rhythm and the harmony. It becomes original and unique. One example, I just wrote a Chiptune Village theme recently, and I've asked people about this all the time. Does it remind you of anything? And no one says it reminds them of anything, but it's really very, very similar to Princess Leia's theme. It's just incredibly different harmonically, and it's different rhythmically, so it has a totally different feeling. So, I don't necessarily think you should feel bad about, I shouldn't say ripping off, but, borrowing inspiration from another composer, as long as you make sure it's completely different emotionally and the context is totally different. Because that's what people will notice, is if the emotional sound is similar. I've noticed that people will tend to say, listen to something that's brassy and fanfare-y, and they'll say, oh, it sounds like Star Wars, even though the melody doesn't sound anything like Star Wars melodic content. They just think that the sound sounds similar, whereas you can write two themes that are very similar to each other motivically, like the motives and the structure of the melody are very similar, but you give them different harmony, and you have the non-musical person listen to it, and they won't hear any similarity. So you realize that even though you as a composer, you hear things very cut and dry, and you understand and compare things, molecularly according to their motivic structure, the average person listening to the melody doesn't do that. But anyway, going to this example, so Princess Leia's theme, of course, is da dum 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 ba da dum. Excuse me. Dee dum dee dum dum da da dum. So I was like, well, let me take that first little theme and put it into Mixolydian. Ba-da-da-dum-dum, with a little bit of change. Ba-da-dum-da-da-da-dum-dum. And then, a different rhythm. Ba-da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum-bum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum-bum. And then I went in a totally different direction from it. So I'll go ahead and play that for you real quick. Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate your support. I was originally going to make it just one big long chunk, but then I realized it was going to be over an hour long after I wrote the script and recorded it. So I decided to just break it into 3 episodes. So stay tuned for the next episode where we talk about emotional impact and catchiness. I'll see you then.